Today, I'm going to talk about how we fuel customer insights with dbt at Airbyte, the company I work at. I was thinking of alternative, more catchy titles, and one thing that I thought about was maybe rephrasing and titling this as a guide to becoming BFFs with your product manager. So what I'll do today is I'll walk through a few examples of how we're actually using analytics and data to power not only internal feedback and discovery, but also how we actually enable the data teams to build products that our end users actually also see. So just to, here's the clicker. A little bit about myself before we get started. So I'm Natalie. I am a senior product manager at Airbyte. We are at about 100 employees, to give you some perspective to the size of our team. My own path to product is a little bit unusual. My background is actually in operations and analytics at a few different companies I've listed there. So what I think that gives me is an interesting perspective on how we can actually use data and partner with data teams to actually build more leverage and value for our users. All right. So I'll start with the takeaways, and you'll see this slide later too, but I want you to keep these in mind as you think about these examples that I'm going to go through. So I'm just one PM. We have a team of 2 people on our data team, an analytics, an analyst, and then also a data engineer. Together, I think we're basically the dream team. So my area is to help users learn about Airbyte, use Airbyte, and then get value from Airbyte. So I think all about the practitioners and the users that actually are thinking about ingestion into their data destination, warehouse, lake, you name it. And I really fundamentally believe that data teams are revenue drivers. And the 3 examples I'll go through are different ways in which they essentially help PMs in their roles. So the first example I'll go through is how we actually empower continuous discovery. So continuous discovery to me is how do we think about getting feedback from users, making that really timely, so it's actually relevant and top of mind when we ask for that feedback, and then how do we bring that into product roadmaps to help prioritize what needs to actually be worked on. So I'll start with what we were seeing. So we would run campaigns, and we would see that we'd send some emails, and by we, I mean the product team. We'd ask, how are things going with Airbyte? You know, this generic, what we have always seen around NPS surveys. You've probably seen them in products you use. Honestly, that was really generic. It was generally too late, and people were no longer engaged. So the feedback we were getting when we got it was pretty vague and not really actionable for our team to go and do something with. So what we were trying to solution for was, how do we make the feedback that we get actually actionable, specifically around the areas we're interested in developing next? How do we make the time to response faster? So making people actually think, have a problem that they want to solve, and us ask about how we can help to solve that problem for them. And the third thing is we also want to build features with active design partners, right? We don't want to build things in a vacuum. So when we get engaged people who actually are caring about the problem right then and there, we actually can also work with them to actually build out the solution as it gets prioritized. So I have a few examples here. The first one I'll talk about is actually how we use our existing tech stack and set up automation to do some outreach. So we use a tool called Gong. It does voice recording, call transcript and recording. And essentially, we have a few key phrases that we're looking for here. So the example I used was people are actually looking for data enrichment, filtering, tagging. Our product doesn't offer that today. That's something we're looking at developing. So what we've done is we have actually said, OK, I'm going to tag this phrase. We actually have an AI tool on top of that, which actually summarizes the block. So the reason why this doesn't look like an actual transcript or a quote is because actually this tool called Fabius is summarizing the product gap for us and delivering that to us. And then we have Zapier, which actually just says, OK, I see that this product gap has been identified, and I'm actually going to filter for that. We also do a few things like, I only want to talk to people who are not yet customers, and I'm also interested in people who are looking for a cloud product. So this actually, you might notice, actually circumvents anything around the data warehouse for now. But this is the quickest time to actually getting something set up very quickly. And then the next thing that we do, actually through Zapier too, is actually just send an email to Customer I/O. And Customer I/O is an email tool we use to send triggered emails. And what we saw immediately was that the reply rate was much higher, because not only did we target, but we actually sent that email very quickly to people, so that when we actually saw a call where someone was interested in this feature, we basically just sent them an email right away and said, let's follow up and talk about this. So this is optimized for speed, right? You can see that we aren't really doing anything around the data warehouse. We aren't doing anything yet in dbt. But if you have something like a very quick feedback cycle you want to implement, this can be really helpful using a pretty simple tech stack. And that's what I want to get across here. The next example we have is something that is more evergreen. Like, we know this is kind of on our longer term roadmap, and we know we want to get feedback from people over time. And so we actually took a different approach where we actually looked at another unstructured text source, like Zendesk. Zendesk is what we use for support tickets today, and so people will sometimes write in about features. They'll of course write in about bugs or things that are going wrong, but if someone is interested in something, we want to be able to capture that. And so we take our Zendesk data, we put it into Google BigQuery using Airbyte, and then we take a bit more holistic approach. We try to extract other parts, like enrich it, essentially, and we say, okay, what's the ICP, so the ideal customer profile fit? We do these filters so that when we actually set those meetings, they're actually valuable meetings for us, and we know that we're setting a meeting with a customer that's kind of our target customer. And then you can see that there are a few other filters on there, similar to what you saw on the last slide. And then the last thing that we do here is actually we set up a reverse ETL flow to then send a really similar email. Notice this email is really simple, but it's very to the point and specific. What I didn't put here is actually the only other sentence I put here is a Calendly link to my calendar so that I can set up a meeting, or they can set up a meeting directly without having to respond again to me. So not a huge difference in reply rate, as you can see. It's still better because it's more timely and it's more specific. But this is a more infrastructure forward approach where you're not just setting up and optimizing for speed, but you're actually putting it through like a real kind of pipeline that's repeatable and trackable. So the opportunities are kind of endless, right? I gave you two examples, very oriented around the tech stack that Airbyte uses, but honestly, you're probably not using those tools and you're using something else, right? So inputs like Zendesk and Gong I called out, but of course, you're probably collecting a ton of unstructured data from many different sources, and you might be using things like Front, like GitHub, if you're open source like us, Chameleon as an example of an in-app survey tool. There's just so much data out there that is in a format that just can be ingested into a place that you can then filter, you can enrich, you can clean, and you can figure out how to actually create an output to the email tool that you're using. So these are just a few suggestions, but honestly, what I'm hoping to communicate through to you is you can set this up too, right? Like, you don't actually need a total infrastructure like all these tools, but there's simple versions where you can optimize for speed, like I said before, or you can make these pipelines using your data warehouse and dbt. Cool. And so just to quickly go through some learnings I had. So there's, on the input side, dealing with unstructured data can be hard because it's not structured like many other API sources or databases that we might be used to. So we use a tool called Fabius I mentioned earlier, and what that allows us to do is allows us to generate a very standardized AI-generated summary for product feature gaps. So maybe you have tools like that at your disposal. Extracting and cleaning. To be honest, Zapier wasn't the ideal solution, but actually it was the easiest for cross-team adoption. Right? It's this click and drag approach, very easy for people to understand how it works, and that ultimately was the fastest thing that people, not just me, but across the team could adopt. I would say a history to track records is really helpful. So if you're sending it through Zapier, you could potentially set up a step to send to a Google Sheet or something as well. But honestly, the approach of using the BigQuery as a data warehouse, then having a dbt model on top of that, that allowed for us to track the history of who we had sent to, and then also understand in the past how that had trended over time. So from an analytics perspective, of course, the data warehouse putting the data warehouse in there allows you to have that history tracking. And on the customer I/O side, when we send emails, honestly, shorter is better. For our audience, we are mostly talking to data engineers, analysts, many of you in the room. And so we just avoid any fluff, right? We're honest, we're direct, we give the context, and there's not really much more to the email than what you saw on the slide. You honestly don't need to make it extremely personalized. We didn't try to create some sort of, it's not an outbound motion, right? It's not like it's a warm email where they already have an interaction with us. So they're already kind of familiar with the brand, and so there's not really a need to do some sort of personalization to the person. It's just a simple outreach email, and the timing is really more influential to getting that response rate up. All right. So crawl, walk, run. I think we hopefully are familiar with this concept, but at a lean startup like ours, crawl, walk, run is something we talk about a lot. And what I've just talked about is really just that first part, right? We prototype something, we do that discovery. Usually what we're optimizing for is anywhere from 3 to 5 features or product areas that I'm doing this just prototyping for. And what it allows me to do is continually meet with people about the things that I want to learn more about. The walking approach is how do we actually build this into a dashboard? How do we track trends over time? All of that can be powered by your data warehouse and dbt. And then the last thing is data at rest is meaningless, right? Just because it sits in the data warehouse doesn't mean that's the end state. So what do we actually use it for? For me, all of that ends up becoming how do we prioritize the roadmap? When I get this qualitative feedback from meetings, that then feeds into how important is it for someone to understand, or for this feature to be available? How will they use it? Are we developing it in the right way? And what I'll show next is an example of what that kind of dashboarding and eventual prioritization looks like. So as a just random example, I have a search term here, SharePoint, which is a connector that we're thinking about developing. And what we can see in Metabase, which is what we use for our dashboarding tool, is that 18 accounts have mentioned it over time. It represents this amount of opportunity value, and then also a little bit about who's actually asking for it. So if I didn't log this all somewhere, I wouldn't know like that this was relevant to these companies at this point in time. And so all of what I've showed you, this trigger-based prototyping approach, that's all great for in the moment, but when it really comes to next quarter, what do we want to build? Next 18 months, what do we want to build? All of these features get rolled up into categorizations of what, how important it is, how much value we think it'll unlock, and then also gives us a sense of how they also compare to each other, right? Because we're not just going to develop SharePoint, we're also going to try to develop maybe Oracle or SAP HANA or other connectors too. Okay. So that was just my first example around how the data teams and the product teams really work together to really deliver a core part of the product manager's job, which is discovery. But of course, product managers think about other things like retention, value. And so this example of a project where I worked very closely with our data team on is around improving customer retention using an artifact called the Airbyte Weekly Digest, which is something that is actually a great example of something that's user-facing. So again, problem statement, similar to last time. This time the problem was a little different. It wasn't about response rates or engagement, but it was actually about how Airbyte as a product was infrastructure that people only thought about when something bad was happening. Very common in infrastructure products. So when your ingestion breaks, you reach out to support, you ask someone what's going on at Airbyte, and we try to resolve it. But ultimately, that leads to a lot of, that's just what we call frustration signals. We felt like the customers were only reminded of Airbyte when things were going bad, not when things were going great. And then they also had low visibility into what was happening under the hood. Airbyte as an infrastructure product, there's a lot of complexity around how we sync data into people's destinations. Then it led to also missed notifications, frustrated users, and honestly, a lot of surprises around syncing behavior and also version upgrades that were happening in the background for them. So what were we solutioning for here? We wanted to really change the narrative from something that was constantly negative to, oh, something's broken and something's on fire and need to be fixed, to, oh, Airbyte's working and it's working in the background and I don't need to worry about it. And then also we wanted to create this basic observability around our cloud product. So, so that people would know if there were changes that were upcoming or even if something had been broken and they had missed it. So this is just what it looks like. And there's more to the email because there's more pieces of Airbyte that are interesting to people. But just to give you a sense of what we actually display to users, this is a weekly email that goes out around how much data is moved, what syncs are successful, which connections are moving data, and then some additional information around if there are changes being made under the hood, giving visibility to users about that. And yeah, we send this through Customer I/O if any of you are curious about how we implemented this. So I'll talk a bit about how we actually do it. So essentially, we're grabbing the event. We are relying on our Postgres data, which is the database that powers our product, to get the information about something we call breaking changes. So connectors change their APIs, and so we try to give people a window to approve those changes. So essentially, we're grabbing the event, we're bringing that into our data model, and then we're actually formatting it into an array. And so for each of the sections of our email that I showed here, each of these sections, like separated by this horizontal bar, you can see this bulleted list or numbered list, and that is all generated by an array because in a given account, there can be many, many-to-one relationships. So bulleting was really important here. And so we repeat this for everything, every stat we want to show. And so what we learned from this was, even as Airbyters even, we're dogfooding our own product, we celebrated when our stats, like our sync success rate, were at 100%. The weekly digest was actually the only way that we would be alerted that everything was fine. We would share it in the company. We'd say, oh, great, this week, everything was great. There were no errors. And we only would have known that because we had the weekly digest now to talk about it. Positive emails are well received. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with sending out marketing emails. We actually currently have an open rate of about 50%, having implemented this for now a number of months. That's fairly high for basically what is generally like a marketing email that gets sent once a week. And we use that as a barometer to see if the information is valuable and if people are still engaging with the content. And what I think this really validated for me as a product manager was that data teams can fast track and validate a product solution. So none of this stuff is actually that revolutionary, right? Like sync success rate, notifications. Ultimately, we want to build this into the product. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't have that big of a team. It's not necessarily a feature, like a part of our product at this point. So in order to fast track demonstrating value to users, instead of building it in the product right away, we validated that quickly through this email, and then now eventually we're going to build it into our product as an actual feature for people to use. So for me, what this demonstrated was how data can help to bring an idea to life that the product team can evangelize and prioritize. And again, like I'm not the person who actually worked on this project, so I want to just pause and give a shout out to Anil, who is our analyst on the team. He helped instrument all of this and build it all. I'm just here to help share his work and talk about how it impacted the product lifecycle. And the last project I'll talk about is actually a project meant to tackle churn. So this is an interesting one, and it's all about scale and how Airbyte scaled with the number of customers as it grew. So we call this, I'll call it here, the robot success manager. So traditionally at companies, you'll have a customer success manager. And usually that customer success manager sets up regular weeklies, quarterly reviews, checks in all the time, someone that is your point of contact at the company that they're buying services from. We don't have that role. So what we saw was wrong was that our retention rate for customers was at about 70%. And industry standards usually indicate that it should be something like 90%, so we knew something was wrong there. We also knew that users would churn gradually from individual connectors. So maybe if you're using Airbyte for a lot of different things, you might churn individually from one connector, but not immediately right away. So what we wanted to do was ask for feedback immediately, not at the end when they finally churned, but incrementally as they stopped using connectors. We want to get feedback on whether the experience with that given connector was actually a bad one. And the other thing was we scaled really quickly to 1,000 customers. We had no dedicated CSM, and that led to frustrated users, a lack of proactive support, and this is something we wanted to tackle with our data team. So again, this is actually just what it looks like, the output. Checking in on your Slack sync. Hey, just checking in. I noticed you turned off all your Slack connections in your workspace. And I see a typo as I read this out loud. Anything I can help with there? So the typo was unintentional, but this is just an example of a kind of email that kind of similar to that framework that you saw at the very beginning, but this is an evergreen email that we send to to users when they turn off their connections. So this is actually what we're doing behind the scenes. We're snapshotting our product table. And so we're saying, hey, take this table that we generate, create a daily snapshot of that, and then compare it day over day. So it's essentially taking today, looking at yesterday, and seeing which connections have been turned off, and if there's a reason for us to trigger an email. And this email gets triggered anytime there's a difference, right? Today versus yesterday, something got changed, and so we end up automatically sending it. And honestly, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive here. The emails get sent from me, the replies get also sent to me. So people are really happy to see that they're actually being supported and proactively looked after. And the automation is set up once, but I get feedback that people are really happy that I'm looking after the account. I'm not actually looking after the account, but now you all know. And I also get product feedback, right? People are happy that I reach out, and they're actually more willing to say, oh, right, I did turn those things off yesterday. Yeah, let me tell you why I'm having difficulty X, Y, Z. So this has been a great place for me to feel like I'm also helping to change the narrative around whether the customers are feeling supported, and also get that feedback about specific connector experiences before it's too late. So our learnings here was around simple language. So I think I said this a few times before. We do a few dynamic parameters. We don't do a ton here, but it is, like you saw in the example, we just say reaching out about X name, and sometimes we don't include that personalization, but the response rate doesn't change that much. So we don't really do a ton of personalization here. We, of course, change up the email template periodically. So if you're getting the same email for a year, I imagine that would feel weird to a customer. So we do change up the email template, let's say every month or two, 1 month or two. Very, very slight wording changes. And then the last one is actually probably the most important one, add guardrails in case snapshots fail. So we automated this whole thing, and there was a day where the snapshots failed and the email went fired to a lot more people than it should have. And I got a lot of emails that day asking me what was going on, was my report wrong? And I apologized to every single one of them, saying, yeah, it looks like my report was wrong on my side, sorry. So in the case that snapshots fail, think about ways you can add guardrails. You can do that in your data model. You can also do that in the email tool. We set it up in multiple places after this happened. But yeah, this an outcome of over-automating can mean that the customer experience sometimes falls prey to failures in automation. And it wouldn't be an Airbyte talk if I didn't pitch Airbyte for 30 seconds. So Airbyte is basically a tool that helps to ingest data from whatever sources you might need. I talked a lot about customer I/O on the destination side, but how that all is powered is if you have a data warehouse, if you have unstructured data coming in from, say, the Zendesk, the Gongs, if you have structured data, say Postgres, Airbyte handles all of that. And ultimately, we all have a ton of sources that we're trying to bring data in for. So Airbyte is trying to make that as accessible and easy as possible. So if you haven't checked out Airbyte, I highly encourage you to. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. So thank you.
Hi. First of all, great presentation. I had a question. So you talked about the PLG, the product-led growth motion, where you're reaching out to customers based on their product activity. They're not active. And you said there was a good response. But in terms of churn, did it improve retention, like when you reached out? Or was it like more understanding what we can improve in the next product roadmap?
Yeah, I think sometimes it did. And mainly because they've sometimes actually didn't reach out to support about their issue. Maybe they didn't know or they didn't feel that support could help them, and we were able to get them back on the right track by either escalating to technical support, thinking about a potential like quick fix in on-call. And so when it was an achievable like problem to solve, we ended up helping that customer. I think it's probably it's a harder thing to say like, oh, this person didn't churn from Airbyte at all, like overall, because they feel like they have a CSM. That feels like more fuzzy. It's more of an indirect correlation. But yeah, I think if the problem was achievable, like, oh, my connector doesn't do this thing, then we could try to solve it more immediately for them. Yeah. Sure.
Emails, did you see an increase in unsubscribe rate because like you're changing and you're like,
I see.
Yeah, more proactive in like sending emails to customers?
Yeah, so actually, to be honest, the ones that come from me do not have an unsubscribe. Yeah, they are not, they are triggered emails, and so they're not, like the weekly digest does, but the ones that come from me that are automated actually are pure, because they're just text and they're just coming from me, they don't have an unsubscribe option.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Hey, great talk. I was curious about in the Gong and Zapier motion you had. You mentioned Zapier was able to scale out to other teams. What exactly did you mean by that? And kind of an add-on question, were you the only one capable of kind of adding in new keywords, or did you scale that out to other team members as well?
Yeah, I would say other team members, I guess. So our other product manager doesn't necessarily come from a data background, so they're much more comfortable in no-code tools, and so that's what I meant. I imagine that if, say, our BizOps team were to also be interested in this kind of thing and do that kind of outreach similar, like they could adopt like a no-code tool like Zapier. Yeah. There was a second question. I don't know if I ever, did that answer your question? Okay. Great.
Hi. I would just want to know if you've been seeing any better outcomes in feature usage or any changes in when you're seeing them no longer use a connector. When you reach out, are you seeing improved product feedback from how they're using it?
Well, I think the product feedback is much more specific and present in them. So I think the product feedback itself tends to be more detailed when it's top of mind for people. So in that sense, I would say it's much more actionable for us to be able to do something about. Versus I've been on calls where people just say, like I had some issues with Stripe. And then when you try to dig in, they're like, I don't honestly, there's something finicky about the UX. And so it's really hard to get specifics. And so when it's kind of present in their mind, it gets to be, I've gotten paragraphs about an experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great talk, thank you. So I was wondering, so this method you're presenting is getting feedback directly from your users. Do you use any other data source like web event data to kind of get a sense of what customer like to use about the feature, which one they being bothered with? Like any suggestion regarding that area?
Yeah, so we use Full Story as our web tracking tool. It does session tracking for those who enable cookies, and so we do use that more qualitative, more from like a watching party perspective. So one way we extend the usage of this with something like that is if someone writes into us about a specific piece of feedback, we actually can go and look at their session and understand what maybe they were struggling with to get even more context to the problem. In terms of feature usage, we usually use Postgres for that and segment events to see what's actually being used from a feature perspective.
You're actually building internal like a data set out of it. Like say for example, there are a lot of tools out there like post hot data, like they do obviously they're doing the same thing, they're tracking the click and all the actions customer taking. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. Like it's using the quantity data to confirm that quality feedback was something that we need to take care of. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always a balance of the qualitative aspect, like the words people are giving, and then seeing like funnels and building out those using something like Full Story, Pendo, or Heap, any of those tools. Yeah.